No, Tony said that, he felt like he was moving into the world.
Yes.
And I mean, I hope we cherish that wonderful advantage of insight we have in this country.
That it's worked.
That the world can be reflected in just a few blocks. I mean, our daughters are intensely proud of being they're intensely proud of being the Chinese young women growing up in a French Catholic, Spanish Jewish family, and going to a Catholic school. And they don't see anything odd about that.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody should. It's America, as far as I'm, concerned.
When I heard Scott at the StoryCorps Gala in New York, it was clear to me just how important the themes of family, heritage, and history are in his life. And I was moved by his personal stories. Like you, I have been an avid listener to his programs for many years. Scott has won every major award in broadcasting for his personal essays, war reporting, and commentary. He has reported from all 50 states, scores of foreign countries, and 10 wars, from El Salvador to Sarajevo to Afghanistan and Iraq. He hosts Weekend Edition with Scott Simon Saturday mornings on National Public Radio, a broadcast the Washington Post has called the most literate, witty, moving, and just plain interesting news show on any dial. Additionally, he has hosted numerous public television and cable programs. Scott is a Chicago native and currently resides with his family in Washington, D.C. Scott will be joined on stage by Margaret Talcott, a multi-talented member of our team who is the originator and curator of our American Inspiration Author Series, a continuing program that was launched to accolades and standing room only audiences this fall. Margaret has been producing literary events for the past decade, presenting such celebrated authors and thought leaders as John Irving, Margaret Atwood, David Brooks, Sonia Sotomayor, Stephen King, and most recently at our headquarters, Gail Collins of the New York Times. She has done a remarkable job in bringing authors of such high caliber to our historic treat rotunda and to these special dinners, working in partnership with WGBH and Porter Square Books in Cambridge. Tonight, we especially welcome producers of WGBH Forum who are here shooting this event with the support of the Lowell Institute. Scott will be in conversation with Margaret for 20 to 25 minutes, and then we will look to you for questions. Ryan Woods will then join them on stage for our award ceremony. Now, on to our program. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed honoree and friend, Scott Simon.
After you, sir.
No, after you.
Oh, thank you. So I must say, it's really wonderful that you have ventured north at this time of year. You are a man of many cities. You were born in Chicago. You met your wife in New York. You have traveled through China to adopt children. And you
I have 2 children. I don't
range
around the country picking up stray children.
Well, that's their loss.
Yeah.
That's their loss. And spend a lot of time in Normandy. Your wife is French.
Yes.
And that's where her family, now your family, is.
Yeah.
And I was so relieved to hear earlier in the week that you really like Boston, too.
Oh, I love Boston. I love Boston. I've always loved coming here, and I've been doing book appearances here, and I was at yesterday morning. I was trying to find the Boston Sports Club, and I thought this is one of the things I love about. I love cities that have their own sense of humor. Obviously, Chicago. It's one of the things I loved about Sarajevo. Sarajevo had a very distinct and durable sense of humor. Certainly, that I got to know while the siege was going on. So, not as dramatically. So I'm walking down whatever street it is. I'm looking for the Boston Sports Club, and there's a man in athletic gear. So I stopped him and I said, excuse me, do you know where the Boston Sports Club is? And he said, no, but I know where Dunkin' Donuts is. and slapped his stomach and said, better. And I just thought that's so Boston. I mean, I know there are, great museums and cultural institutions here as well, don't get me wrong, but I love being here in Boston.
Did you find somebody more helpful after that, I hope?
No, but
No,
I did find it on my own.
I have learned a tremendous amount about you from reading your books. You have written an enormous amount on adoption, on your mother.
Stephen King has written a lot of books.
Yes,
I've
that's true.
9.
That's true,
Yeah.
but he isn't also a broadcaster.
I was corrected by a middle schooler the other day who's asking, and by the way, I love doing books. I'd never written a novel I'd never written any kind of book aimed at young readers before. And I found it so much fun to go around to schools and be in libraries and classes and talk to youngsters. But in any event, it came time for questions, and he said, so do you like Stephen King? And I said, yeah, I do like Stephen King. Because they were saying, well, how come you set most of your books in Chicago? And I explained that all of us have a kind of ground zero, and that I said Faulkner, who you will be reading later, sent everything to county whose name I can't pronounce in Mississippi. Pardon me?
Yoknapatawpha.
Oh,
Who said that?
A+.
Beautifully done. Thank you. And I mentioned a local author who I liked a lot, read a lot growing up, Edwin O'Connor, The Last Hurrah, The Edge of Sadness. And in any event, so I said, yes, Stephen King, and I think he sets most of his novels in Maine. And the young man said, no, he had one in Derry, New Hampshire. He had me. What can I tell you? I know there are significant differences between Maine and Derry, New Hampshire.
Yes, there are.
Yeah.
There are. Vermont and New Hampshire even more so.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'm learning.
I know a tremendous amount about you, but I don't know how you became a reporter and a broadcast journalist.
You just fall into these things. I was always the kid in school that put out the school newspaper, or the underground newspaper later, that sort of thing. I worked for a group in Chicago called the City News Bureau, which is now defunct, where they would send you out with 2 rolls of dimes, and you would be either in a police station, where I often wound up, or sometimes the emergency room of a hospital, and you would just report on what was going on there. And I did that for some time, and I believe it or not, the really treasured position there was actually being in rewrite, where you would actually get a phone call, you'd put on a headset and rewrite. If you could write quickly and lucidly, that was considered to be even in a step up. I loved my grandfather on the Irish side of my family. It might be unnecessary to add here in Boston. He was a police officer. He was a police sergeant in Chicago, and I loved being in police stations. I loved talking to cops, and I know a lot of terrible things went on there too. But
So you had a knack.
I love that. Hospital emergency room. So in any event, I just began to do it.
And you have written this amazing book about Tony Bennett, which I love. And you described early on, and actually, I'm so curious, how did that Tony Bennett book come about?
Well, it's actually written with Tony. He would tell me stories, and I would eventually, make them into a book. His son Danny called. I had interviewed Tony on 2 occasions. They'd liked the interview. Tony really liked the book I did about my mother.
We all did.
And had not quite realized, I'm from a show business family. And he'd been looking for someone to help out on this book. And he thought, I would be a good person to ask, because I was from a show business family and felt some kinship. And I think he's one of the great reigning artists in America. You approved my participation, Margaret. And I remember we had, they talked to your agent. And my agent said, well, if you want to do it, fine, but you should think about, you've never done a book with someone before. Would that be a good thing for you to do? And so Tony and I had lunch again in New York, and he said, "Yeah, kid, I know just what you mean. I always took top billing. The only time I didn't is when I worked with Frank Sinatra and Duke Ellington." And I thought, okay, all right. If Frank Sinatra, Duke Ellington, I think I could work on a book with you. And I loved it. I loved hearing his old stories. I loved, trying to put them on the page. I loved hearing about his life, about his evolution. It was great. I loved it.
I sensed a slight kinship between, he's an urban guy, you're an urban guy. You grew up in Chicago, he grew up in Astoria, Queens.
No. I think there was a lot of that, and no doubt about it. My father died when I was 16. No doubt about it. There was a lot of, I think, father-son tug there too.
Yeah.
And so that's why I welcome the chance to do it, and I learned so much. It was just wonderful. The role he's had in American culture.
Yeah, no, as someone who is always looking for inspiring stories and inspiration in all sorts of forms, his book was about all the people who have had an influence on his life and who have inspired him.
And you noticed how we put, how Tony's father is at the end of the book rather than at the beginning? I was proud of that.
Yeah.
So you could see it all traced back.
And so did he give you any order of these folks? Did you order the book? Did you order who came first?
Oh, that was kind of my job.
That was your job.
And, obviously we went through the editing process, and moved some stuff around because you didn't want to necessarily have, forgive me for being this blunt, two Italian singers right next to each other. They really do have to be spaced out a little bit in the book. So, you would put Nat King Cole in there first or something
like that. Mix it up.
Yeah.
He said that, I think I became a singer to try to care for my mother in the way my father wanted to himself. I was determined to be successful to make up for all that she'd had to sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I do wonder, looking at various careers people have, to what extent does one enter a career in reaction to something, a need that be filled, or a parent's desire, or something you learned from you mentioned your grandfather in police stations.
Yeah.
Do you feel in any way called to your career?
No, not at all.
Okay.
It's an interesting question, Margaret, and I wish I could answer it better, but no. No, I think, and I say this having obviously written about a lot of people, having, reported about a lot of people, I think we all, fill in the blanks with each other. Somebody told me years ago that, because I was 16 when my father died, he said to me, "You realize," he said, "I'm sure it was painful at the time, but he said, you realize, don't you, that that's really going to make you a writer?" I said, "No way." And he went on to say, because you're going to write because it's a way of keeping up communication with someone that who you missed out in those important years. And it was very interesting. With that, I hope I'm just not getting, not getting dark here. I wrote a book called Unforgettable, which you apparently have read, where I spent. You were at my mother's memorial, as a matter of fact, in Chicago, Margaret. Sorry to keep. That was a fun memorial, wasn't it? As these things, it was at Rick Bayless's Mexican restaurant, the Frontera Grill, and because my mother had said to me, just something in Rick's place would be fine. And now I don't know why people don't have memorials in Mexican restaurants all the time. You see like state funerals for departed monarchs, and you keep thinking, well, wouldn't a Mexican restaurant be just a little friendlier than that dank old cathedral? But in any event, we had been in, I spent a lot of time, that week with my mother, and my father had been a problem drinker. And my mother had never not told me the truth, but I think there's some things you decide you're just going to let go when it's at the last moment, and I think she felt that I was strong enough to be able to take it. And she said, I think when your father died, my father, technically he drank himself to death. She said, I think your father died when he did because he realized he just couldn't pull himself out of that tailspin, and that it was the best thing he could do for you.
Really?
And my God, yeah, I was like, wow, too. And I think if she'd said it to me when I was under any different circumstance, if she herself hadn't been sort of on that edge, and if she had said it to me when I was younger, I would have been affronted. But I think she understood exactly the right moment, which underscores for me once again, timing is everything.
Well, your mother was quite a communicator.
My mother was quite a communicator.
She wrote lots and lots of letters to people. You
Yes.
reported.
And to me, as a matter of fact.
And
Yeah,
to
she
you.
would like, I keep trying to remember, there was a woman, Gretchen Hellfigger, who I think still works at WBEZ in Chicago. And my mother had been at some station function with me, and I think I had to go somewhere, I forget exactly what it was, and she had wound up sharing a cab with Gretchen. And my mother felt it was wrong for Gretchen to pay for the whole cab fare. And so my mother had sent her $5 and the most beautiful, elaborate note talking about how kind Gretchen had been. And Gretchen said, I was going to write a thank you note back to your mother, but I realized my stationery wasn't good enough.
Oh, really?
She said I had to go out and buy something that looked better before I could write a thank you note to your mother's thank you note.
funny.
So my mother had a way of calling out the best, and she believed in writing notes. And
Well, it seems like she stepped up her production toward the end of her life. That you say that. It also seemed to me that as her life wound down, my mother was inspired. I deliberated a long time over that word. I think it's right to pass on memories, lessons, and insights with the sharpened perspective of someone who has already begun to see what is next.
Yeah.
The wisdom that my mother had won over a full, fascinating, and involving life hardened and glowed into a few words that she wanted to share with me and my family.
yeah.
And she wanted to pass on advice ASAP, you wrote.
Pardon me?
You wrote, I think she wants me to pass on a
yes,
couple of pieces of advice ASAP.
Yeah.
And she said that to you when she was in her hospital in those last 2 weeks of her life. Please share these things. Or was it something you intuned? You could tell?
No. She was wonderfully lucid. Really about everything, and I think particularly in the last few days when she had, and I have heard this from other people who have been blessed, because I consider that week I spent with my mother to be first and last a blessing. But I've heard this from other people who've been able to have a similar blessing with somebody to whom they've been close. There is a kind of almost diamond hard kind of brilliance, as long as they can communicate, that can come into their view of life. And that's absolutely, I think, the frame of mind and the kind of vision that my mother had. And it was it was wonderful. It was enlightening and it was inspiring, and she was often very funny. It was also, my mother was an old nightclub performer before she married my father, who was a comedian. It was her last great performance. And, it was also, I think, not entirely just for an audience of one, or even just me and my family. I think it was also, she knew what I did for a living. I think she also knew, in fact, she trusted me to share that. So when she would say to me things, like, she looked at me at one point and she said, honey, you should interview more people in their 80s. I said, why? And she said, because they have looked, and I'll never forget this, because, at that point, her hand gestures were very economical, because she was weak, but she said, because they have looked right across the street at death for 10 years, and they know exactly what counts in life. I was just flabbergasted by that. And that's the kind of thing she said that I think needed to be shared.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I'm not sure she would have said that before. I think she also, well, my mother had survived a cancer operation before she ultimately died, and I remember the night of her cancer operation. We were out to dinner in Chicago, and it was me and my wife and our children and my mother's third husband. And we were coming back, and when my mother was a showgirl, she used to, winters, you may have heard, winters in Chicago can be just a little bit exacting. You're familiar with that in Boston. And she had figured out a way to get back to Rush Street from the Drake Hotel, which is near where we were having dinner, by walking inside the Drake and then walking inside what used to be the Playboy building, and you know, as you learn, a kind of, you know, inner passageway. And we were going through the Drake Hotel, which represents a lot to my family. The Irish side of my family, my grandmother, who unfortunately, I write about this, was a suicide. My grandmother, who's all Irish immigrants, worked at the Drake Hotel. Used to say shaking sheets. And then I mean, it was so important because they all had brogues. I mean, arguably, I'm able to hold a job in broadcasting because my mother got rid of her brogue. My mother was told, if you have a brogue, you're always going to be shaking sheets at the Drake Hotel, which is why you met my mother, didn't you, Margaret? You don't remember?
I feel like I did.
Well, which is why my mother always talked like this. She always had very good diction, and you know, because she thought it was important. Otherwise, you would be marked as something. Now, of course, what's hilarious is now we think brogues are just adorable, right? And we you know, and I think we've probably grown up as a country that way, but that's what she had. So in any event, the Drake Hotel was very important because on top of everything else, it had, I've never seen it to this day, what I'm told is the most splendid ladies' washroom. So we're walking through the Drake Hotel, as I recall, it's in about this time of year, but in the middle of January, and my mother decides that she simply must take her granddaughters, our children, into the bathroom and show them what the bathroom is like. So I'm sitting out there a little bit uncomfortably with my mother's third husband, not knowing exactly, you know, what to do. And when they come out, the four of them come out, I see that there are tears in my wife's eyes. And according to my wife, my mother had, you know, she'd shown our daughters, because they had lotions and creams and sweet-smelling soaps and all that sort of thing. We'd show them how to wash up and everything. And she said to them, remember, girls, never be afraid to go into a classy place. You deserve it.
Oh, that's so lovely.
And I asked her about that when it was during her last week, and she said, well, you know, I didn't know if I would be alive the next day, and I felt, what do I say to my granddaughters? And she said, yeah, that's the one piece of advice, the best piece of advice I thought I could give them. Never be afraid to go to a classy place. You deserve it.
Oh, that's lovely. You also talk a fair amount in your adoption book and in other books about the importance of exposing your children to history. Yeah. I mean, you have these two beautiful teen daughters who were born in China. Yeah. And you make a point of saying that you want them to very much understand America's history and reaction to Chinese living in this country. They should know that history.
You know, and know it's their history. I mean, you know, because they are, and I think this is good for our country to say the least, but I mean, we went through a period of time, my wife and I, where all of our daughter's babysitters had to be ethnically Chinese, preferably from China. And I must say we didn't necessarily get out much. I finally said, darling, I think we have to stop racially profiling our babysitters or else we'll never see what's going on in the world. They did have, I mean, they had a lot of wonderful babysitters. But, you know, the fact is, they might begin to get an idea that the Chinese immigration to this country began with graduate students, going to MIT or Georgetown or something like that. And it's important to us, without putting too heavy a hand on it, that they know that the first Chinese who came into this country came as indentured servants, that they know that it was Chinese people who built the railroads, that they know it was Chinese people who built so much of this country. And they weren't always here as graduate students or buying up American countries, for that matter. And I must say, I'm very happy that our 16-year-old in particular she's pretty sharp about the subject of China. I mean, she follows it, she knows what's going on. She very much identifies with the pro-democracy marchers in Hong Kong. She's proud of being Chinese, but she's also very critical of the policies of China's. I mean, I'll say why I have the chance. She doesn't like these American. Our 13-year-old wanted to get tested for her DNA testing, so for her birthday, so she spit into a tube. And I think that's what it was in this one. And, you see the ads, and there's somebody who says, all these years I thought I was German. Imagine my surprise when I found out I'm really Italian. So we get the test back, and it tells our 13-year-old that, in fact, she is 98% Chinese and 2% Vietnamese. And my wife and I were joking, well, we could have told you that, and it was our 16-year-old who pointed out, she said, the Chinese government uses those tests to identify ethnic minorities in China.
Oh, wow.
And in the case of Uyghurs and other Muslims, put them in camps. And she said, I don't want to take that test.
Wow.
And I just went running over to her and kissed her and said, you're right, baby, you're right.
Wow. You bring up a similar story of a family who had adopted a child from, was it Burundi? And that they wanted to make sure that he had been to the Pettus Bridge and that he was aware of the Selma to Montgomery March.
These are the Burkes in Chicago, yeah.
And
These are, unfortunately, yes, you're talking about Alderman Edward Burke and Justice Ann Burke in Chicago, who are our friends. They have 5 children who are adopted. It's a little awkward to tell this story now because Alderman Burke, who I don't care what happens in life, I like him. He's been indicted. Chicago.
It's the story of Chicago.
I really don't think a group of people in Boston should feel like, they've never heard of that happening to a local politician. But they're a wonderful family, and they adopted Justice Burke, who is now a justice on the Illinois Supreme Court, Ann Burke. A wonderful person. She, by the way, also led, to bring this tirelessly back to Boston, she also led the laity that investigated the crimes of clerical abuse in the Catholic Church in America. I really liked Justice Burke. In any event, she, at that point, was working in the public aid department. There was, as a lawyer, she was about to go home one Friday night. There was a youngster, African-American youngster, who was going to be put in an institution that weekend. His mother couldn't take care of him. She was incarcerated. And Ann Burke said, this baby is not going into an institution. And took him home. Mother was sent to a long, I won't draw out the story, but they wound up adopting the young man, and they made a point of taking him to the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the anniversary. They've done a lot of things like that, and it's interesting because it's also important to us too that our youngsters, they certainly know. I can't say they know their Chinese heritage in the sense that they know their families, but they certainly are aware of Chinese culture and a certain amount of Chinese history. It's also important to us that they know American history, and of course, my wife being French, that they know French history. And we are lucky in Normandy that they are increasingly interested I mean, we introduced them to do people here know the Bayeux Tapestry?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
We introduced that. My wife and I were skeptical that they would register any reaction at it except, when can we have a crepe? And it was like a graphic novel to them. They loved it. They thought it was absolutely great. They'd like to go back to see it. And I remember the first time we were walking along Omaha Beach. And I forget exactly what anniversary was coming up, but I turned to our children and I said, X number of years ago. And let me also explain. It's particularly pertinent in our family because my mother-in-law, who has died since, I think you left us, Margaret. My mother-in-law, wonderful mother-in-law, Marie Amelie, spent the first 5 years of her life living in the cellar of her family's farmhouse in Normandy because it was occupied by German staff officers.
Wow.
And, that's a tough beginning in life. She and her brothers and sisters. And I will explain that her older sister, who's still with us, my Aunt Claire, the French just have a different attitude about this sometimes. Aunt Claire will say, "Oh, Scott, the German officers were so handsome, and the uniforms were so nice. They were so nice to us." Now, I am sure these German officers were away from home, and the children in the cellar reminded them perhaps of their own children, but we're just not used to French people. Oh, the German, such great guys. In any event, that's our Aunt Claire. Can I tell the story? Oh, it was the...
Walk on the beach.
Yeah, I'll tell that story.
Yes, there's a lot of good stories
so
here.
we're walking along the beach, and I turned to our daughters and I said, X number of years ago, this was a very different kind of scene. A lot of brave people surrendered their lives to liberate France and to save the world, from the menace of Nazism. And our oldest daughter turned around and said, "I saw a documentary about it, okay?" So I'm thinking, okay, we don't need to say anything else. Now when we go back there, they are very eager. We have returned to Omaha and Utah Beach. They've been very eager to see I don't know if any of you go to Normandy, the Aromanches area, as it's called, where the temporary, amazing technological feat of building the docks that are,
Yes, amazing.
And now they have become much more interested in it. And in part, it's because of their relationship with their grandmother. And alas, she's gone, but they had a really close relationship with both of their grandmothers. And I think they understand their grandmother a little bit better after the fact, once they realize some of the history. And my late mother-in-law had such an antic sense of humor. It was absolutely delightful. It was delightful to me, but I mean, she could be a character. And I think they understand it better when they think of the little girl growing up in the cellar and, huddling in the cold and being frightened by the bombing and wondering how her life would be.
How lucky that they got that memory from her and from you.
Yeah.
In so many of your books, you present to us the melting pot that is America, and Astoria, Queens, through Tony Bennett, all of the freedom that he felt moving from Little Italy to Astoria, and the mix
where they had different,
of
where they
Polish,
were different.
Jewish, all sorts of varieties of
Greek,
people.
lots of Greeks in Astoria, as I guess there still are in
Yeah.
Astoria, Queens, lest me not forget. No, Tony said that, he felt like he was moving into the world.
Yes.
And I mean, I hope we cherish that wonderful advantage of insight we have in this country.
That it's worked.
That the world can be reflected in just a few blocks. I mean, our daughters are intensely proud of being they're intensely proud of being the Chinese young women growing up in a French Catholic, Spanish Jewish family, and going to a Catholic school. And they don't see anything odd about that.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody should. It's America, as far as I'm concerned. That when they were there at Catholic school once, it was during Hanukkah season, and none rushed out to say to my wife, Elise, our oldest daughter, tells us that you light the menorah at night during Hanukkah? And my wife said yes. She said, well, could at least bring in the menorah tomorrow and talk about Hanukkah. And my wife is thinking yes, and then she's thinking, well, mostly what Elise knows about Hanukkah is I get candy. So we're going to have to do a little homework tonight so she can talk about the Maccabees and everything. So in any event, and then the nun said, well, this is before they went to all girls school, Brendan and his family, they're Jewish too, but they really say they're more Buddhist. And I thought, this is America, this is wonderful. I thought, this is absolutely great. And our daughter, born in China, brought in the menorah the next day and talked about Hanukkah. And why not? I think
I'm sure she did a great job. Now, let's talk about the ethnic mixing and melting pot that did not work, which was Sarajevo, which is where you were.
Well, I think left to its own devices, the melting pot did work in Sarajevo. Mm-hmm. I think it also worked in central Bosnia. I think it was maybe the rest of the country and certainly the rest of the world where it didn't work out. And one of the major things that I grew to admire so much about people in Sarajevo, 7 times they were offered a road to resolving the conflict that would involve the ethnic division of Sarajevo and central Bosnia, and they said no. That's not who we are. That would be dividing family from family, children from parents, grandparents. That's not who we are. And I just had a world of admiration for what they did and how they handled themselves. Because in Sarajevo, when I was there, it was odd to run into a family that didn't have some kind of ethnic mixture, because they had been intermingling really for 5 centuries at that point.
That would be an interesting DNA test.
Well, that hadn't occurred to me.
That would be a very interesting DNA test.
But it was one of the many, and I think it's also what gave them such a rich sense of humor. I think it's what gave them such an outlook in life. And the thing that I found as a journalist, and I mean this altogether, I think it's something to bear in mind as we look across the world today. I had always told myself, as that group of journalists who came up during the everybody wanted to be a Woodward and Bernstein, or in the whole idea that if Americans knew the truth, damn it, things would change. And I think what we saw in Sarajevo was that not just the United States, but Western Europe, the world at large, absolutely knew there was genocide going on of Muslim and mixed ethnic people and looked away. And in fact, I was particularly depressed because it seemed to me that much of the world was using their powers of intelligence to come up with excuses to turn away. I mean, I would hear from people, oh yes, the suffering in Bosnia and Sarajevo is terrible, but look at what's happening in Somalia, and more people die of traffic accidents in the United States. Where do you begin? Which I think is using the information and knowledge you have to find an excuse to look away, to not act. And then, of course, 10 years after a genocide, you have a very lovely memorial service and vow never again. And this is something that we saw in Rwanda, obviously something that we saw in Sarajevo. I think beyond argument, you've seen it just a couple years ago in Syria. You might be seeing it in Yemen today. Other instances all over the world. And it's this, the increasing identifying people by only ethnicity, making them subject to some kind of subordinate role in that society, a lack of care for human life, out of some, I don't mind saying, twisted idea of nationalism and populism. Sorry to get so serious, but in any event,
it's important to hear. It's important to hear, and I mean, look, as someone who loves India and has been a reporter in India, I cannot believe that in Mahatma Gandhi's India, there is now what amounts to a Hindu supremacist law. Mahatma Gandhi gave his life for a multi-ethnic, multi-religious vision of India. And I just find it flabbergasting that all these decades later, they still have Gandhi's picture hanging up in Indian offices, but are now
are now
Yeah.
putting up laws that seem to renounce what he gave his life for.
Yeah. To bring it back to
Oh,
this
sorry.
country and to
Yeah.
this room, do we want to take any questions, Brenton and Courtney? Why don't we get the microphones around? And just quickly,
Sure.
you could pick any day of the week to report, I bet, these days, and you stay on the weekends. Is that because it's a family time, you like the weekends?
Well, no,
or-
Saturday, I mean, is a different, I think it has a, what do we?
It has a better
different
spirit to
feel
it.
to it, I think.
Yeah.
Saturday has a different feel.
It has a
to
great
it.
feel.
And it's a weekly show as
Yeah.
opposed to
Yes.
a daily show. So
Yeah.
it's a little bit more personalized perspective. And yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I enjoy, yeah.
Ted, do we have anybody with a question over there? Anyone want to? Wow, you're. Please, Henry, go right ahead. A microphone coming from Ted right there.
Could you take the microphone away from that?
Yeah.
I actually have two questions, and
Henry,
Scott,
sorry.
one is on the humorous side, one more serious. And just a moment ago, you talked about Americans saw the truth in Sarajevo, in Bosnia. Last week, Americans saw the truth with Mary Louise Kelly
Yes.
and her interview with Secretary Pompeo. You ran that interview on Saturday morning in its entirety. What was your take back from that?
What was the impact?
Your take back from that interview that she did with Pompeo?
My wife and I sent Mary Louise flowers.
I think that says a lot right there.
And we said, thanks for making us proud.
Yeah, lovely.
But you had to decide to run that interview on Saturday morning, and you had to decide that pretty early.
Honestly, we had to fight for it because it was on, what do they call that show in the afternoon? Yeah, I can't remember it either. There's some, in any event, but it wasn't heard by much of the country because the impeachment hearings were going on. So Barry Hardiman, one of our editors, said, we have to get this on the, and forgive me in front of Margaret, but there is still a mindset at NPR. I sometimes say, it's the last bastion of East German culture sometimes. There were some people who said, but it's on All Things Considered, and Barry, arguing down there for us, said, well, it was on 3 stations in the country in rural Utah that were actually, was it on WBUR on Friday?
I heard it on Friday night.
Well, I stand corrected. Then maybe they had a point. But we thought it was important enough to rerun on Saturday. And look, I mean, I want to be very, I think Mary Louise made us all proud, an exemplary interview. When I say us, I anybody who has the temerity to call themselves a journalist. That being noted, I think we should also count our blessings in this country. This is not Russia, it's not Brazil, it's not the Philippines, it's not Mexico. There was absolutely nothing. Mike Pompeo could only, forgive me, act like an ass with Mary Louise, because there's nothing he can do to a reporter. We're blessed to live in this society. We don't throw reporters out of windows like they do in Moscow, and I know it can be tempting. I'm looking at you, Henry. They're not routinely assassinated as they are in Mexico or the Philippines. We're very lucky to be able to have that freedom. I do think, for a little plug here, I think all of that underscored the important difference that NPR represents in this world. Because in fact, we don't have a political or ideological agenda. We believe in journalism, and we believe in journalism that is tough, and we believe in journalism at the same time that is absolutely fair. I mean, we're not just running points of view that certain people agree with. We are running every point of view that we can say. I mean, the same morning that we had Mary Louise's interview and the beginnings of the meltdown from Secretary Pompeo, we had someone from the White House, a man named Stephen Groves, on the air, and we asked tough questions of him. And I tell you, we thought that interview would be canceled up until the last minute, and I salute Mr. Groves for not canceling it, because he must have known it wasn't going to be a walk in the country. So, you know, thanks for that. But I mean, I think that's what public officials should do, and certainly that's what reporters should do. So we're very lucky to have this blessing, and we shouldn't douse it with silence. We have to be, you know, I think more outspoken than ever. That's not to say proponents one way or the other or any other kind of way, but it's more important than ever to give people reliable information, and that's aggressively gained. You know, people, look, I remember, not the same thing at all, but I mean, I did a tough interview with Bill Cosby, which was mostly noted for that he refused to answer the question. And I remember, you know, his people had been calling up in advance saying Mr. Cosby is a very generous man, and he knows that NPR didn't traffic, and to be specific, they didn't traffic that kind of sleazy tabloid nonsense about what the reports were about him at that point. And he and Mrs. Cosby had these hundreds of millions of dollars and might, you know, they've been looking for places that they could award that. And I'm going to say an awful word here in august surroundings. And I went to see the then president of NPR, Jarl Mohn, and I said, look, I am telling you we've gotten these phone calls from the Cosby people, not because I want you to do something, because I don't want you to do something. But I don't want you to be blindsided, and here's the calls we've been getting. And Jarl Mohn said to me, do your job. I don't need to explain in Boston what that, right? Yeah. I pronounced it differently than, you know, local Providence has here. But in any event, and you know, and so we did, and we can forget there was a lot of criticism then that we were helping to tear down a great national icon. Why had we done this to one of the few prominent African-American cultural figures in the world? Now, I mean, I think it looks better because obviously he's in prison. But, you know, there was criticism at the time. That is going to happen. Not everybody is going to agree with everything we do. And I tell people who listen to us, you're not going to agree with everything that you hear, and that's the whole damn idea. You are going to hear from us ideas and stories that will upset your view of the world and that will make you angry, and that's why we're worth tuning into, and that's why we're listening to. And if I might quote a Chicago Bear here, as opposed to a member of that...
Red Sox.
No. The
Patriots.
Patriots,
Yes.
Right, that's it. I'm sorry, you know, you don't win a Super Bowl for 2 years, you just forget about it.
Yes.
But
Who are they?
Walter Payton, the great Chicago Bear running back, used to say, you just take the hits and keep on going. And I think that's what we have to do.
Yeah, I think we're going to end on that. Yeah.